Hello, this is Andrew for the channel Open Book Night. Although this is officially the first video, those numbers that you saw are a reminder of what was covered in video 0. Now we're going to get into the timeline looking at the historical books of the Old Testament. Okay, this is my take on the historical books of the Old Testament, and specifically to create a timeline. What I have done is used the time frames described in the books themselves. So this again is to scale as we jump in. The first book, I'm going to begin with the first human. We understand he was Adam. After 1,656 years, a major global flood event occurs and nearly takes out all of humanity. The book of Genesis continues after this flood for 636 more years. And here is where we meet the three people we know as patriarchs. The first patriarch was Abraham, and he purchased land in what is modern-day Israel. His second son was Isaac, the second patriarch, and Isaac's second son was Jacob. Now, according to the Bible, Jacob had at least 13 children with 4 different women, and his name was changed to Israel. So the last patriarch was the beginning of the Israeli people, the children of Israel. And before this book concludes, Israel and all of his children have moved to Egypt. Before we get to the next book, there is about a 400-year time gap. So for 400 years, these people are living in Egypt, and their numbers are growing. And the Pharaoh at this time wants to get rid of them. So under the leadership of a man named Moses, they decide to leave. So Exodus, or exit out of Egypt. If you're familiar with the Bible, you may be thinking, hey, Andrew, you're leaving out a couple books here. Well, this is a main timeline. We'll come back and look at some of these other books. But in terms of historical sequence, there's some overlap with what I know as the book of Numbers, which some may know as the book of Wandering. After the exodus from Egypt, Moses leads the people through the desert. In what should be a few days' journey, they spend 40 years wandering through the desert. And this, like everything else, was God's design. God says, I am angry with this generation. So they never get back to the land that Abraham had purchased. The next leader, Joshua, crosses the Jordan River and goes through a conquest of all of the land. It takes about 7 years to retake all of this land. The most well-known story, though, is the fortified city of Jericho. Joshua and his army topple the walls and take over the city in just 7 days. So now you have the people and you have the place. Everything should be good, but there's another 400-year period described in this book called Judges. Essentially, judges were acting leaders or rulers at that time. There's a quotation at the end of the book that basically summarizes this period and says everybody did whatever they thought was right. So after these rebellious teenage years, the people decide that they want to have kings. And there's a man named Samuel who is chosen by God to go and anoint the king. And there's a succession of 3 kings. The first king was a man named Saul. But at one point, Samuel says, Saul, you have offended God. You don't get to stay king, and your son Jonathan won't be king. Instead, the kingship transfers to another man named David. So the book of 2 Samuel primarily chronicles the kingship of David. I'll point out that Samuel himself dies somewhere in the first book, but the second book is still known as 2 Samuel, for what that's worth. Now, one of David's sons becomes the third king, Solomon, and it's said that Solomon was the wisest person ever to live. Unfortunately, he also offends God. God says, your kingdom will be divided. So after Solomon, the nation is split into 2. 10 tribes form one kingdom. The other 2 tribes form another kingdom. And coincidentally, the book is called 2 Kings, but this chronicles a longer period of time in which various individuals take over kingship of one kingdom or the other. Now, the northern kingdom does not last. The kings are basically all bad, and God says, I'm done with you. The southern kingdom lasts for a longer period of time. It's better to say this is an inconsistent. You've got some good kings, you've got some bad kings, some mediocre kings. But eventually this kingdom too is toppled. They are conquered. And officially the nation state, the people of Israel, go into exile for 70 years, a period of 70 years. After this, two separate books will chronicle the rebuilding of the temples in Israel. There's Ezra and Nehemiah. They're contemporary, although Nehemiah, the book, covers a longer time frame as walls and other ramparts and fortifications are built. Now, this essentially concludes the historical portion of the Old Testament, and there's 400 years before the events of the New Testament. But the bigger takeaway for me, putting all this together, was to realize something in terms of the scale. This book of Genesis, by itself, is as much of the timeline as all the rest of the historical narrative put together. I believe you can even fit the New Testament in its entirety into the time frame. So considering every book that's come after it, the same amount of time transpires in Genesis as all the other books. Now, a topic for another time is whether the universe was created in those 7 days before Adam or if it was a longer period of time, which people have very strong opinions about. But I'm going to focus just on a couple of stories that begin with Adam and begin with his first two sons. Now, some people have said, if you understand these first two stories in the Bible, you understand the rest of it. They claim that everything else is a commentary on the first two stories. From my perspective, I think that misses the point a little bit, so I'd like to unpack these two stories for you. Okay, so in the garden, God had two humans, and he had one rule. But the snake is going to twist the story, and these first humans will end up breaking God's one rule, which is, don't eat the fruit of this tree. Now, the man, Adam, was actually right there with Eve and the snake, but he said nothing. He did nothing. And when the two humans broke the rule, they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. Now, their first two sons, after they were expelled, Cain and Abel, one is a hunter, one's a gatherer. Each makes their offering to God. But when God prefers Abel's offering, Cain's response is simple. I'll just kill Abel. Okay, so what some people would say is one's a story of relationship of God to people, and the other one is man to man, but really God is in both stories. Again, it was because of the offering to God that Cain killed Abel. So both of these stories relate humans to God and how we fail. And even though one failure is quite a bit bigger than the other, the punishment is basically the same. The first humans are kicked out of the garden, and then Cain is told, you will wander among the earth and that you will have no home on the earth. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this video and what I wanted to cover. As you will see, every story is unique, but every story involves God. And so as we go forward, we will continue through this book of Genesis leading up to the flood.